Winning a European trophy is any football club's dream. It creates a legacy lasting decades and cements their club in the history books till the end of time. For some, it's taken 30 plus years of European football before they can finally get their hands on a trophy. For others, they win a trophy within 5 years of making their European debut. And for a select few, they show us that you can win a European trophy in your debut season. Here are the teams that won a European trophy in 3 seasons or less. In the late 50s and early 60s, Celtic were a team who'd constantly finished middle of the pack in Scotland, seeing rivals such as Rangers, Hearts and Dundee make appearances in the European Cup. But after making the semi-finals of the Cup Winners' Cup in 64 and 66, Celtic made their debut in the European Cup in 1967, thanks to their first league title in 12 years. In just their third ever season in Europe, Celtic bested FC Zurich, Nantes, Vojvodina and Dukla Prague before beating the mighty Internazionale 2-1 in Lisbon to win the European Cup on their debut. In the space of 10 years, Aston Villa went from 3rd Division football to European champions under the reign of manager Ron Saunders. League Cup wins in the 70s led to 2 appearances in the UEFA Cup, in which they were knocked out by Royal Antwerp in the first round and Barcelona in the quarter-finals. But when the Villains won their 7th and final league championship in 1981, they made their first ever appearance in the European Cup. And just like Celtic, in their 3rd ever season in Europe and first in the European Cup, Aston Villa defeated Bayern Munich 1-0 to become the 4th English team to be crowned champions of Europe. The 1980s was a successful decade for Sampdoria. With the likes of Gianluca Vialli and Roberto Mancini up front, Sampdoria won 3 Coppa Italias in 5 years, qualifying them for 3 Cup Winners' Cup campaigns. A second round exit to Benfica in 1986 was followed up by a loss against Barcelona in 1989. But Sampdoria got their revenge the very next year, beating the likes of Borussia Dortmund and AS Monaco to reach the final in Sweden. There, Gianluca Vialli scored twice in 3 minutes after extra time to bring home the Cup Winners' Cup in just their 3rd season in Europe. In 1958, Benfica crashed out of the European Cup in the preliminary round to Sevilla. But 3 years later, in 1961, they got their revenge, beating Hearts, Ujpest, AGF Aarhus, Rapid Vienna and Barcelona to claim the European Cup in just their 2nd season in it. In the very same year, in the Cup Winners' Cup, Fiorentina were still reeling from their European Cup final defeat to Real Madrid from 4 years ago when they entered the Cup Winners' Cup. And in just their 2nd season in Europe, they beat Rangers 4-1 on aggregate in the final to lift the trophy. Fiorentina would lose in the final to the next team on this list in Atletico Madrid. Madrid got to the semi-final of the European Cup in 1959 in their debut season, losing to their city rivals Real Madrid. But in just their 2nd season in Europe, they navigated through Leicester, Werder Bremen and Fiorentina to win the Cup Winners' Cup. Tottenham Hotspur made their debut in the European Cup in 1962 after winning the league and cup double in 1961, making the semi-finals and falling to eventual champions Benfica. But Spurs' FA Cup win in 62 allowed them to make an appearance in the Cup Winners' Cup in 1963, and just like the last 2 teams, won their trophy in their 2nd season in Europe, beating last year's winners Atletico Madrid 5-1 on aggregate in the final. Sticking to the pattern, Manchester City followed up a disappointing debut campaign in the European Cup in 1969 with winning the Cup Winners' Cup in 1970, when they beat Polish side Górnik Zabrze 2-1 in the final. With their highest ever finishes in the Bundesliga up to that point, Bayer Leverkusen qualified for the UEFA Cup for 3 successive seasons. Their first season in Europe ended at the hands of Dukla Prague on away goals, but next year in 1986, Bayer Leverkusen beat Austria Vienna, Toulouse, Feyenoord, Barcelona, Werder Bremen and Espanyol in the final on penalties to win their first ever European trophy in just their 2nd attempt. The 1990s were Parma's most dominant period in their history. In their first ever season in Serie A, Parma finished 6th, qualifying for the UEFA Cup, which they unfortunately lost to Bulgarian side CSKA Sofia. However, they also won the Coppa Italia that season too, meaning that Parma would be playing in the Cup Winners' Cup for 1993, a cup which had the likes of Monaco, Liverpool and Atletico Madrid. But Parma conceded just 3 goals on their way to the final, which included scraping past Atletico Madrid in the semis on away goals. With the final being held at Wembley Stadium, Parma dispatched of Belgian side Royal Antwerp 3-1 to become the last of 7 teams to win a European trophy at their second attempt. Before we get to the 6 teams who won a trophy in their debut season in Europe, some honourable mentions. AC Milan's first of 7 European Cups finally came at the 4th attempt, beating Benfica in 1963 to stop them from getting 3 in a row and becoming the first Italian team to win the European Cup. Manchester United became the first English team to win the European Cup when they too beat Benfica in 1968 at the 4th attempt. And FC Magdeburg, the only East German team to win a European trophy, won it at their 4th attempt, beating Milan 2-0 in the Cup Winners' Cup in 1974. Unsurprisingly, the first team to win the first ever European competition, Real Madrid, are in the top 6. In a season with only 16 teams, Real Madrid came from 2-0 down to defeat Stade Reims to become the first ever winners of a European Cup. 8 years later, and Inter Milan embarked on a European campaign for the first time ever in 1964. After beating Monaco, Partizan Belgrade, Borussia Dortmund and Real Madrid in the final, Inter Milan became champions of Europe, 1 year after their Milan rivals on their debut. When West Ham won their first ever FA Cup in 1964, they found themselves in the next year's version of the Cup Winners' Cup. They beat Ghent, Sparta Prague, Lausanne Sport and Real Zaragoza to book a place in the final at Wembley Stadium against 1860 Munich in front of 97,000 fans. With Alan Sealey scoring twice in 2 minutes, West Ham United defeated 1860 Munich to win a European trophy in their debut season. From 1860 Munich to Bayern Munich. And just like West Ham, Bayern's first season in Europe came in the Cup Winners' Cup in 1965 after winning their second of 20 DFB Pokals. The final against Rangers was a stalemate throughout the 90 minutes, until Bayern scored in the 10th minute of extra time to win the Cup Winners' Cup, again in their debut season. When Nottingham Forest were promoted to the First Division in 1977, many people predicted them to struggle. But to everyone's surprise, Brian Clough's men went on to win the league title that very season, placing them into the European Cup for the very first time at the start of the 78-79 season. Things started out tough when they were drawn against defending European champions and league rivals Liverpool in the first round. Despite the hard test, Forest defeated Liverpool, AEK Athens, Grasshopper Zurich and Cologne, and finally Malmo to become champions of Europe and complete one of the most remarkable stories in football history. In 1989, Belgian side KV Mechelen entered the Cup Winners' Cup, having won their first ever domestic trophy the year before. In a season which featured heavyweights in Sporting, Marseille, Hamburg and Ajax, Mechelen stood their ground and never faltered. And when they beat Atalanta to reach the final in Strasbourg, they shockingly beat the mighty Ajax to win the Cup Winners' Cup, to be the last team to win a European trophy in their debut season.